Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped millions of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. This episode contains discussions of murder, genocide, and war. There will be no ads in the middle of the podcast out of respect. To help support us, please consider becoming a patron or giving a one-time donation on our website, morbidcuriositypodcast.com, or on our Ko-fi page, ko-fi.com/mcp. Recently, I've been thinking about something Mr. Rogers said. Quote, "When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You'll always find people who are helping.'" End quote. This simple spotlight of hope inspired me to go searching in the darkest, most horrific places looking for the helpers, and I found one in Anna Essinger. Born in 1879, Anna Essinger lived through 2 world wars and participated in relief efforts for both. She took care of displaced civilians, helped refugees escape Nazi operations, and aided child survivors of concentration camps in recovering and healing after their horrific experiences. Throughout it all, Essinger trusted her gut and chose to help those under fire from the Nazis in any way she could. And the way she could help was through her work as a teacher. Before we hear about her heroism, a little context is required in order to understand why her actions were necessary. World War I was one of the most destructive wars in modern history. The opposing sides were the Entente powers, which included Great Britain, France, and Russia, and the Central Powers, which included Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey. Nearly 10 million soldiers died. The enormous losses resulted from new technology like machine guns and chemical weapons, and a lack of new battle tactics to deal with these new technologies. Property and industry losses were also catastrophic, especially in France, Belgium, Poland, and Serbia, where the fighting had been the heaviest. German leaders signed an armistice, an agreement to stop fighting, in the Compiègne forest on November 11, 1918. Many of them believed they would be treated fairly, as had been previously discussed by the Entente powers. But when world leaders met in Paris to discuss treaty terms, the European countries were brutally harsh, forcing Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war and saddling it with huge reparation payments, military limitations, loss of colonies, and loss of territory. The newly formed German democratic government, the Weimar Republic or German Reich, was beset by vocal political parties that saw the Versailles Treaty as unfair and oppressive. To many Germans, the treaty seemed to contradict the initial armistice agreement, which called for transparency in peace negotiations and diplomacy. Revision of the Versailles Treaty became the main goal of several radical right-wing parties that cropped up after the war. They blamed the German left, commonly seen as socialists, communists, and Jews, for dishonoring Germany by signing a shameful peace. Between 1930 and 1933, a worldwide economic depression hit Germany hard, and millions of people were out of work. The unemployed were dissatisfied with the government's handling of the situation. They were bolstered by right-wing groups who attributed the depression to Germany's national humiliation after World War I. This widespread economic misery, fear, as well as anger with the apparent failure of the government to manage the crisis, offered fertile ground for the rise of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party. Hitler tapped into the anger and helplessness felt by many voters, attracting a wide following of Germans desperate for change. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party for short, promised to end the Depression, lower unemployment, reverse the Treaty of Versailles, quash the threat of a communist uprising, restore German cultural values, and restore Germany to its rightful position as a world power. Hitler and other Nazi speakers carefully tailored their speeches to persuade different sections of society. For example, when speaking to businessmen, they emphasized anti-communism and job creation and downplayed anti-Semitism. When addressing soldiers, veterans, or other nationalist interest groups, they emphasized military buildup and the return of territories lost after Versailles. They assured farmers that a Nazi government would prop up failing agriculture prices. Pensioners all over Germany were told that their monthly checks would remain stable, both in the amounts paid to them and the buying power of German currency. On January 30th, 1933, German President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany through a questionable deal among a small group of conservative German politicians. This group had given up on parliamentary rule and hoped to use Hitler's popularity to buttress a return to conservative authoritarian rule, perhaps even a monarchy. However, within 2 years, Hitler and the Nazis outmaneuvered Germany's conservative politicians to create a Nazi dictatorship completely controlled by Hitler. The Nazis began their infiltration of the German government with the civil services. On the 7th of April 1933, the Act for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service was issued, legalizing the removal of anyone of non-Aryan descent from the civil service. To the Nazis, Aryan meant the superior race and indicated white Germans, and excluded Jewish, Black, and Roma people. Non-Aryans were prohibited from becoming citizens and marrying or having children with those of German or related blood. This act also removed any judges that were deemed non-compliant with Nazi laws or principles. The German Civil Service Code of the 26th of January 1937 then retired any judges or judicial officials who refused to comply with Nazi values. The People's Court was created by the Nazis in April of 1934, with judges chosen specifically for their Nazi beliefs. When it replaced the Supreme Court, the Nazification of the judicial system was complete. To take control of cultural policy, the Nazis appointed Josef Goebbels as Minister for Public Engagement and Propaganda on the 13th of March 1933. He controlled the national media, film, theater, arts, and other cultural aspects, ensuring that they advocated Nazi ideals. On the 4th of October 1933, it was declared that all newspaper editors and publishers must be Aryan. Any person publishing anti-Nazi material was threatened or imprisoned. By 1935, over 1,600 newspapers were closed. The German government feared revolution in the wake of all these changes and tried to maintain the illusion of democratic stability. However, following the fiery destruction of the German parliament building due to arson, the Nazis used the panic and fear of government officials to pass the Reichstag fire decree. This law suspended the right to assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and other constitutional protections, including all restraints on police investigations, in the name of preventing violent uprisings from communist threats. About a month after the decree, the Enabling Act was passed, which made it legal for Hitler and his Nazis to bypass the government altogether and rule by decree, creating laws they claimed would stabilize Germany and eradicate its internal enemies. In reality, the laws secured the Nazis as the sole ruling party in Germany. Hitler was now a dictator. The Nazis used the Enabling Law to remove civil rights, take away personal freedoms, and imprison their political opposition for an indefinite period for any reason or no reason. Trade unions were banned, and then on the 14th of July 1933, all political parties except the Nazi Party were banned. The Enabling Law made these actions appear legal, and the Nazis kept up this charade by claiming these measures were justified for the security of the country. The true motive was to remove any opposition under the guise of legality and protection. The Nazis also used terror and intimidation to control the public. The Nazi Party's paramilitary organization were the Sturmabteilung, more commonly known as the SA. The SA were formed in 1921 and were known as brown shirts due to their brown uniform. The SA were primarily responsible for the protection of leading Nazis and disrupting other political opponents' meetings, although they often had a free rein on their activities. In 1925, Hitler established the Schutzstaffel, otherwise known as the SS. The SS were initially Hitler's personal bodyguards, although the division expanded rapidly to police the entire Third Reich. The Nazis used the SA and SS to harass and imprison any potential opponents of the Nazi Party. Again, due to the enabling law, this harassment and imprisonment was legal. In 1933, around 200,000 people were seized and imprisoned. Overcrowding in prisons forced the Nazis to create temporary prison camps in any spaces they could find. The first concentration camp, Dachau, opened on the 20th of March, 1933, and was located in a broken-down munitions factory. These camps were brutal, unsanitary, and rife with abuse, neglect, and torture. The Nazis concealed their rapid consolidation of power through controlled media coverage. For example, the Night of Long Knives, a violent purge of political opponents in which over 150 people were murdered and hundreds more were arrested, occurred at the end of June through early July 1934. The Nazis sculpted media coverage to portray the event as a preventative measure against revolutionary, violent, and uncontrollable forces, rather than a series of political murders. By the end of 1934, the Nazis had infiltrated and taken control of every major aspect of German government. However, local governments proved more difficult to infiltrate, and even at the end of 1945, only 60% of local mayors were Nazi Party members. Even more difficult to control were small communities and educational institutions, which brings us to Anna Essinger. Essinger was the oldest of 6 girls and 3 boys born to a non-observant Jewish couple, Fanny and Leopold Essinger. Leopold Essinger served in World War I in Verdun, France. While in the Imperial German Army, he noticed widespread anti-Semitism among the officers. In 1899, at the age of 20, Essinger went to the United States to live with her aunt in Nashville, Tennessee. While there, she financed her education by teaching German language and running a hostel for students. She received a bachelor's degree in German studies, then went on to get an MA in education at the University of Wisconsin. She eventually became a teacher and lectured at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. While in Tennessee, Essinger became acquainted with the Quakers. The Quakers, also known as the Religious Society of Friends, are a religious group generally united by a belief in each human's ability to be guided by the inward light of morality. Quakers include Christian values as well as non-theist principles. They avoid creeds and hierarchical structures, such as the clergy, to wear plain dress, refrain from alcohol, refuse to participate in war, refuse to swear oaths, and oppose slavery. Many Quakers had refused to serve in the military and, like other pacifists, were persecuted, sometimes severely, for their beliefs. Yet Quaker pacifism was not a passive resignation to evil doings, but a belief in the positive expression of love and reconciliation. As an active commitment to peace, Quakers engaged in relief and reconstruction work in Europe during and after World War I. The Quakers formed the Friends Ambulance Unit, aiming at cooperating with others to build up a new world rather than fighting to destroy the old. Led by the British Quakers, the Friends War Victims Relief Committee and the Friends Ambulance Unit began their efforts among non-combatants in 1914. These men and women were later joined by volunteers from the American Friends Service Committee, which was formed in 1917 when the United States entered the war. Together, they provided civilian relief in France, Belgium, Russia, Serbia, Austria, and Poland. In 1919, Quakers extended their efforts to include a program of child feeding in war-ravaged Germany. Essinger was deeply impressed and joined them in their war relief efforts. In 1919, with Quaker-sponsored humanitarian aid, she returned to Germany to convince mayors, teachers, and school rectors to set up kitchens for displaced children, making sure they got a hot meal at least once a day. She also collected food and clothing to distribute to them. Her sister, Clara, was also a helper. In 1912, Clara founded an orphanage in Hurlington using her dowry, the money set aside for her marriage. There she cared for problem children, as well as mentally unstable and disabled children. In 1925, as her own children and many of the children in her care reached school age, she decided to turn the orphanage into a boarding school. Several members of the Essinger family got involved, including Anna. The Landschulheim Herrlingen opened on the 1st of May 1926 as a private boarding school. Anna Essinger became headmistress, and her other sister, Paula, who was a trained nurse, became the school nurse and its housekeeper. Anna ran the school similarly to a Montessori program, valuing communal living, mutual respect, and a shared sense of responsibility for the school. Everyone, teachers and students, felt responsible for the community and the building. The school accepted children from all regions, was co-educational, and the teachers also lived there. Often, the pupils were on first-name basis with their teachers. The children learned 2 languages, English and French, with emphasis on the spoken rather than the written word. Emphasis was also placed on physical exercise and learning through living, whether from daily walks in the woods, from tasks required of the children in and around the building, and at mealtimes. The arts, including painting, drawing, singing, drama, and music, were also taught. A 1927 report by the Ministry of Science, Art, and Education described Essinger as, quote, extremely competent, end quote, and her teaching as, quote, skillful, fresh, and stimulating, end quote. Essinger herself was described as a formidable figure, stout and stern, strict but also fair, and respectful and loving. She provided a caring family environment for everyone at the school. Most staff and pupils called her Tante Anna, or Aunt Anna, or just TA for short. Every evening, Essinger read a story to all the children and then gave each child their preferred pre-bedtime cuddle, a hug or kiss before sending them off to bed. Essinger was immediately wary of the Nazis. She immediately went about quietly boycotting their acts and proclamations. When all public buildings were ordered to fly the Nazi flag on Hitler's birthday in 1933, Essinger planned a day of hiking for the pupils, leaving the flag to fly over an empty building. She was denounced by the Nazi Party, and their attitude toward the school became increasingly negative. Soon, an inspector was ordered to be installed there. Essinger knew that her school had no future in Germany and began to look abroad for a new location. She eventually found a spot in southern England, an old manor house dating from the time of Henry VIII in the village of Otterden in Kent. The house was large, with extensive grounds, making it ideal for a boarding school. It needed some work, but Essinger knew she and her students could handle it. The children's parents were quickly informed of the change of location and unanimously gave their approval for Essinger and her teachers to take the 66 children out of Germany. Essinger disguised their flight as a school trip, and on September 5, 1933, they arrived in southern England. Essinger didn't formally close the old school, but turned it over to Hugo Rosenthal. It became a home for Jewish children, with more than 100 children enrolled. The new school was named New Erlingen, but was generally called Bunce Court. From the beginning, money was tight. Fees were set at £100 a year, but many couldn't pay due to their refugee status. Therefore, everyone, staff and pupils, had daily chores and did building repair work, from converting stables into dormitories, laying telephone cables and repairing furniture, to gardening, growing vegetables, looking after the chickens, and peeling potatoes. The school included a large vegetable garden, 2 greenhouses, 500 hens, beehives, and several pigs, all tended by the pupils. The children grasped the situation they were in and pitched in. Classes were small, from 5 to 8 pupils, and focused on English language and literature, history, and math. German literature was also taught to maintain the children's cultural foundations and underscore that human values are generally the same everywhere, despite what was going on in Germany. There was no money for a laboratory, so the sciences were minimal, though student interests in science were encouraged outside the classroom. The official language of the school was English, so new teachers from England weren't expected to learn German for at least a year. However, most German staff and pupils reverted to German or a combination of German and English, so most English teachers and pupils learned German. Essinger accepted English children to the school as well, especially non-Jewish children, to foster the non-denominational aspect and bring in some financial and linguistic support. Religion was not stressed, but was part of the curriculum. Those who wished to observe traditional Jewish Friday evening worship and holidays were able to do so. Most Bunce Court pupils had assimilated into the local culture and knew very little about Jewish culture. Nazi persecution and discrimination had made them aware of their Jewishness, so the school added courses on Jewish history, the teaching of Jewish prophets, and the ideas of Jewish philosophers. At the time, war hadn't broken out yet, and the English people weren't aware of what was going on in Germany, or why Essinger would want to move the school to England. Within a year or two, however, Essinger won the respect of the local authorities and had advocates from all areas of public life. They had built a community around and within the school. By October of 1937, there were 68 pupils enrolled at Bunce Court, 41 boys and 27 girls. All but 3 of the pupils were boarders, and all but 12 were foreign-born. Bunce Court was their home, so even after finishing their education, some pupils stayed on for a number of months, living at the school while working elsewhere, their wages aiding in the upkeep of the building. On the 9th and 10th of November, 1938, Nazi SA and SS forces carried out a pogrom against the Jewish citizens of Germany and Austria. Jewish-owned stores, homes, hospitals, schools, and synagogues were ransacked. Windows were smashed. Walls were demolished with sledgehammers. Over 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and incarcerated in concentration camps. This 2-day riot was later named Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, as the streets were littered with shards of glass for weeks afterwards. Hitler made no comment whatsoever, despite speaking to journalists less than 24 hours later. The events were widely reported, and the eyes of the rest of the world were opened to the terror being inflicted on innocent people by the Nazis. It's estimated that around 100 people were killed during the events, but afterwards, it's possible that as many as 600 people died due to post-arrest maltreatment and by their own hands. Unfortunately, this was only the beginning. On the 15th of November, 5 days after the devastation of Kristallnacht, a delegation of British, Jewish, and Quaker leaders met with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Neville Chamberlain. They requested, among other things, that the British government permit the temporary admission of unaccompanied Jewish children without their parents. A bill was prepared that stated that the government would waive certain immigration requirements to allow unaccompanied children, ranging from infants up to the age of 17, entry into the UK. The Home Secretary, Sir Samuel Hoare, met a large delegation representing Jewish and Quaker groups, as well as other groups working on behalf of refugees. Although Hoare declared that he and the Home Office, quote, shall put no obstacle in the way of children coming here, end quote, the Jewish and Quaker groups involved had to fund the operation and house the children. On the 25th of November, former Home Secretary Viscount Samuel appealed to the British citizens on the BBC Home Service radio station to foster any incoming children. Over 500 offers were made, and volunteers from the service visited possible foster homes and reported on the conditions. The foster families didn't have to be Jewish, but they did need to be respectable and keep a clean house. Soon after, what would become known as the Refugee Children's Movement, or RCM, sent representatives to Germany and Austria to determine how to organize transportation and choose the children. In Germany, a network of volunteers worked around the clock to prioritize children in the most peril: teenagers in concentration camps or in danger of arrest, Polish children or teenagers threatened with deportation, children in Jewish orphanages, children whose parents were too impoverished to keep them, and children with a parent in a concentration camp. Once the children were identified, their guardians were issued travel dates and departure details. They were allowed one small, sealed suitcase and only 10 marks or less in money. Some children had nothing but a manila tag with their identification number on the front and their name on the back. And so began Kindertransport, the mass migration of Jewish children from Germany to the UK and other areas of Europe. The first group of 196 children arrived at Harwich in Essex on the 2nd of December, 3 weeks after Kristallnacht. Over the next 9 months, almost 10,000 unaccompanied children, mainly Jewish, traveled to England, fleeing from the expanding German Third Reich. With Kindertransport came the enrollment at Bunce Court of many uprooted children whose parents were in unknown circumstances, all coming from different social classes and cultures. Essinger found it difficult to find British teachers who were up to the challenge and needs of the pupils. While the children were safe in England, the Kindertransport experience was not without trauma. The primary traumatic experience was the separation of young children from their parents. The youngest children, roughly 6 or younger, generally didn't accept parental explanations of why they were separating and would demand to stay with their parents. Older children were more willing to accept the parents' explanation, but quickly realized that they would be separated for a long or indefinite time. Learning a new language was another cause of stress, as was living with strangers. At schools outside of Bunce Court, refugee children had to deal with bullying from the English children, who often viewed them as enemy Germans instead of Jewish refugees. Older children became aware of the war and the direct threat to their Jewish parents and extended family. After the war ended in 1945, nearly all the children learned, sooner or later, that their parents had been murdered. Some children at Bunce Court were incredibly homesick, and many older children were anxious for their parents, brothers, and sisters left in Germany. Some felt guilty, being the only child of many who was sent to safety. Therefore, teachers were valued more for their empathy and compassion than their teaching ability. The priority was making a good home for the children. At the end of the first year of Kindertransport, the teachers had made themselves available to the children without any time off for themselves. They were exhausted. Essinger quickly established off-duty time to aid in their own recovery. On September 3, 1939, war was declared between England and Germany. Defense Regulation 18B was issued, ordering the internment of anyone suspected of sympathizing with the Nazis. The Home Office then ruled that anyone born in Germany was classified as an enemy alien, and all German males over the age of 16 were interned. This affected Bunce Court. In addition to pupils being interned, some of the pupils who'd gone home to visit their families in Nazi-controlled areas never returned and were not heard from again. With 2 hours' notice to pack their things, the school lost 5 men and 10 of the older boys, the cook, and several female students aged 16, before it was determined that Germans who had fled the Nazis would be released. However, they had to remain in one place until the end of the war. This ended up benefiting the school greatly, as the community was consistent for a long period. In June of 1940, the German Air Force began air raids on England. The 140 students and staff of Bunce Court School were given a week to evacuate when the area was required to become a defense location. The grounds were then taken over by the British military. Essinger found a new location at Trench Hall, near Wem in Shropshire, a few hours away from Bunce Court. The buses that transported the children had to pass through Coventry, which had already been bombed by the Nazis. The children were quite shaken, as they had mostly been removed from the reality of the war. Trench Hall was much smaller than Bunce Court, so the youngest children were sent to another school in Surrey. Still, it was overcrowded, and sacrifices had to be made. The chicken coop and the stables were converted into dormitories. This created enough room for the younger children to rejoin the rest of the student body, but bedrooms had to be rearranged every morning to use as classrooms, as space was still limited. The local residents in the new location were not as accepting as they had been at Bunce Court. They occasionally shouted insults at the students, calling them dirty Jerrys. When the 1944 film Henry V was showing at the local cinema, Essinger kept her students away, partly out of fear of harm from the locals, but also because she'd been warned that the first newsreel reports from concentration camps would be shown before the film. Her students didn't need to be traumatized any more than necessary by seeing what had likely become of their parents. Enrollment dropped after the Nazis banned Jewish emigration in 1941. This eased overcrowding, but the school still had to part with its chickens, pigs, and beehives in order to accommodate students. It was only after the war was over in 1946 that the school was able to return to Bunce Court. The last waves of children to attend Bunce Court were survivors of Nazi concentration camps, orphans who no longer knew what life was like outside of the camps. One of these survivors was Sidney Finkel, who was born in Poland, survived living in a ghetto, deportation to a slave labor camp, separation from his family, and imprisonment at 3 separate concentration camps, one of which was Buchenwald. He arrived at Bunce Court in August of 1945 at the age of 14, severely traumatized. In his 2006 memoir, Finkel said that he was treated with intense care and patience, and that his 2 years at Bunce Court, quote, turned me back into a human being, end quote. With the end of the war, many children from the Kindertransport operation tried to reunite with their families. Agencies were flooded with requests from children searching for any surviving member of their family. Some did find their family, but most discovered that their parents had been killed. It was a devastating time for many Bunce Court alumni and students. After the war, Essinger had a difficult time staffing the school. Refugee teachers left to pick up the pieces of their lives, and the low salary and remote location didn't appeal to new applicants. In 1948, with her eyesight deteriorating and unable to manage the school herself, Essinger closed Bunce Court. Over the 22 years of its operation, Anna Essinger cared for and taught over 900 children. After the school was closed, however, Essinger continued living there and maintained correspondence with many of her former pupils. Many students went on to have distinguished and important careers, such as Richard W. Sonnefeld, who went on to become chief interpreter for the U.S. prosecution at the Nuremberg trials. Despite the lack of science classes, many Bunce Courtians became doctors and scientists. Bunce Court alumni also returned at every opportunity while the school was still in existence. After it closed, they held reunions for 55 years. Most alumni lost the family they left behind, and Bunce Court became their childhood home. Many alumni wrote memoirs that mentioned their time at Bunce Court with reverence. For many students and teachers, Bunce Court was a last refuge that not only saved their lives, but also gave them hope, family, and a solid foundation to start again. If you want to know more, I highly recommend the book The School That Escaped the Nazis, The True Story of the School Teacher Who Defied Hitler by Deborah Cadbury. A quiet yet determined teacher was able to aid hundreds in escaping Nazi oppression and care for them after their horrific experiences. Anna Essinger is proof that even in the darkest, most horrific situations, there are those who help. She is proof that every single person can change the course of another person's life for the better. And that is why Anna Essinger ignites our curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast is produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast or on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and give us a rating on whatever podcast app you use. This helps the MCP reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who has already done so. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing strong. The MCP has joined the Straight Up Strange podcast network, which hosts true crime, paranormal, history, science, folklore, and other enigmatic podcasts. Nothing is off limits when you enter the world of Straight Up Strange. The MCP is also part of the Belfry Podcast Network, a haven for goth culture featuring podcasts, blogs, and videos, all catering to the darker side of life. If you'd like to support the MCP but would rather not become a patron, you can give one-time donations on our website and our Ko-fi page. Also on our website are links to all our social media, a full list of episodes, links to our merch, and our mailing list. We also have an Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. That's bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.